The arrow was already in the air before anyone saw the archer. That was the point. That was always the point. From 300 meters away, beyond the range of any weapon anyone facing them had ever encountered, the rider had drawn, released, and wheeled his horse in a single fluid motion. By the time the arrow arrived, he was gone. By the time the next man in line understood what had killed the man beside him, another arrow was already coming, and another, and another. No walls to hide behind, no formation tight enough to matter, no armor thick enough to stop what was coming, no way to close the distance fast enough to fight back, no way to run fast enough to escape. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere at once. A cloud of riders on the horizon, raining death from a distance that should have been impossible, using a weapon that should not have been able to exist, built from materials no single tree or animal could provide, assembled over months by craftsmen who had turned the act of killing into an engineering discipline. Before gunpowder, before steel firearms, before explosives or artillery or anything the modern world would recognize as a weapon of mass destruction, there was this, a short curved piece of layered wood and horn and animal tendon, no longer than a man's arm span. That could be drawn with a force of 150 pounds and release an arrow with enough energy to punch through armor at 100 yards and reach a target at 400. A weapon so effective that the civilizations that mastered it did not merely win battles, they built empires, they erased kingdoms, they changed the shape of the world. This is the story of the composite bow, and why it was, without serious competition, the deadliest weapon of the ancient world. Start with what it was not. Because understanding what made the composite bow revolutionary requires understanding what came before it, and why what came before it had a hard ceiling that no amount of skill or strength could break through. The simple self-bow is exactly what it sounds like. One piece of wood, bent into shape, strung with a cord, and used to launch arrows. The English longbow, the most famous self-bow in history, stood nearly as tall as the man who wielded it, over 6 feet of yew wood. And it took years of practice and a lifetime of physical development to use effectively. English longbowmen developed skeletal deformities from a lifetime of drawing their weapons. Enlarged left arms, twisted spines, overdeveloped shoulders, the physical record of what it cost a human body to operate a powerful wooden bow regularly and at scale. The longbow was effective. At Agincourt in 1415, English longbowmen destroyed a French army many times their number in a matter of minutes. It was not a trivial weapon, but it was a weapon with absolute physical limits. A self-bow can only be so powerful before the wood itself cracks. It can only be so short before it loses power. And short mattered enormously when the dominant military technology of the ancient world was not the infantryman on foot. It was the mounted archer, the warrior on horseback. Because you cannot fire a 6-foot longbow from the back of a galloping horse. The geometry of it is impossible. You cannot draw it, you cannot aim it, and you cannot reload it at any useful speed while your horse is moving beneath you. The civilizations that solved this problem did not solve it by making their archers dismount. They solved it by building a completely different weapon. A weapon whose power did not come from its size. A weapon whose power came from a radically more sophisticated understanding of materials science than anything that preceded it. The composite bow did not grow organically from a single tree. It was assembled, engineered, built from at least 3 fundamentally different materials, each chosen for a specific mechanical property, each placed precisely where its properties would do the most work, all bonded together into a unified structure using one of the strongest adhesives available in the ancient world. And each of those choices reflected a level of materials knowledge that, in the context of the time it was developed, was frankly extraordinary. The core was wood, usually mulberry, birch, or juniper, flexible enough to bend without breaking, stiff enough to provide structural integrity. But the wood was not doing the primary work. It was the scaffold onto which everything else was built. On the belly of the bow, the side that faced the archer when drawn, went horn, usually water buffalo horn, ibex horn, or horn from mountain goats, depending on where the bow was made. Horn was chosen for one specific mechanical reason, its extraordinary resistance to compression. When a bow is drawn, the belly of the bow is compressed. It is squeezed together. Wood alone will crack under repeated compression stress. Horn does not. It compresses under force and springs back perfectly when the force is released, storing and returning energy with almost no loss. This is exactly what a bow limb needs to do, and horn does it better than any other natural material available to ancient craftsmen. On the back of the bow, the side facing away from the archer, the side that stretches when the bow is drawn, went sinew. Tendons stripped from the legs and backs of cattle, deer, and other large animals, pounded into separate fibers, soaked in warm water to soften, and then layered onto the back of the bow wet, oriented along the length of the limb, allowed to dry and contract. Dried sinew is one of the strongest natural materials in the ancient world in tension. It stretches under force and snaps back like a biological spring. The back of the bow is under tension when drawn, and there is nothing in nature that handles tension and returns energy like animal tendon. The sinew on the back of a composite bow was doing exactly what sinew does inside a living body, storing and releasing mechanical energy at the precise moment it was needed. These three materials, wood, horn, sinew, were bonded together using glue made from the boiled swim bladders of fish, a gelatin so strong and so flexible that it could hold the bow's laminated structure together through thousands of draw cycles without failing. The entire assembly was then wrapped in a protective covering of birch bark or thin leather, lacquered, sometimes decorated, and left to cure. The curing process alone took months. Some bowyers allowed a year or more for the glue and materials to fully set and the stresses within the bow to stabilize before the weapon was considered ready. In that year of slow assembly, the bowyer was not being leisurely. He was allowing the molecular structure of the glue bonds to reach their full strength, allowing the horn to adjust to its new curvature, allowing the sinew fibers to achieve maximum tension in the dried state. The finished bow was short, between 30 and 45 inches for most Scythian and Hunnic designs, compared to the 70-inch English longbow. And when unstrung, it curved dramatically away from the shooter, almost in a circle, because the horn and sinew were in constant tension against each other, even at rest. Stringing it required considerable strength and skill. When strung, it assumed its characteristic recurved profile, the tips sweeping back toward the archer, the limbs storing enormous potential energy in their bent geometry. Draw that string back, and horn compresses, sinew stretches, wood flexes, and every joule of energy you put into the draw is captured in the structure and held there, waiting. Release it, and all of that stored energy, from the compression of the horn, the tension of the sinew, the flex of the wood, transfers instantaneously into the arrow. The result was an arrow velocity and striking energy dramatically greater than anything a self-bow of the same length could achieve. The draw weight of a war-grade composite bow could exceed 150 pounds. The absolute range of a well-made composite bow with a skilled archer could exceed 400 yards. Ottoman chroniclers recorded that Sultan Selim III shot an arrow approximately 963 yards, a distance that has never been equaled by any modern composite bow. At combat ranges, the composite bow's arrows could punch through armor at 100 yards. The same armor that could stop a self-bow's arrow at close range was penetrable by a composite bow's shot from distances that made close-range combat irrelevant. This was not simply a better bow, it was a weapon that operated in a different tactical dimension from everything that came before it. The first confirmed physical evidence of composite bows, bows containing all three core components of horn, wood, and sinew, comes from the tomb of Tutankhamun, the Egyptian pharaoh who died around 1324 BCE. Howard Carter's excavation recovered 32 angular composite bows from that tomb, along with arrows, quivers, and bow cases, but those bows were not Egyptian inventions. The archaeological and material evidence makes clear that Egypt acquired the composite bow from elsewhere, likely from the Hyksos, a Semitic people from the northern Levant who occupied northern Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period, roughly 1650 to 1550 BCE, and who brought composite bow technology with them as part of a package of military innovations that included the horse-drawn chariot. Many of the Egyptian composite bows in Tutankhamun's tomb were made from ash wood and covered in birch bark, materials that could not be sourced in Egypt and had to be imported from the north, suggesting either the raw materials or the finished bows arrived from distant origins. The composite bow, in the form that would shape the next 3,000 years of warfare, almost certainly originated somewhere in the Near East, Syria, Anatolia, or Mesopotamia, during the middle of the second millennium BCE, and from there it spread with remarkable speed across Eurasia, along the networks of trade, war, and migration that connected the ancient world. By 1200 BCE, it had reached China's Xinjiang region. By the 7th century BCE, the Scythians of the Eurasian steppe had refined it into perhaps its most tactically devastating form. The Scythians were nomadic warriors who dominated the vast grasslands stretching from the Black Sea to the Caspian Sea from roughly the 9th century to the 3rd century BCE. Their composite bow was relatively short, 80 to 100 centimeters, carried in a combined bow and arrow case called a goritos that held up to 75 bronze-tipped arrows, and it was built in a distinctive double-curved recurve profile ideally suited to use from horseback. The Scythian approach to warfare was simple and devastating. Ride, shoot, ride again. Never close to melee range unless forced to. Maintain a constant rain of arrows from distances that made retaliation impossible. If the enemy advanced, retreat while shooting. The infamous Parthian shot, firing backwards over the horse's rump at full gallop, required a bow compact enough to swing and draw in any direction while mounted, and the Scythian composite bow was exactly that. Their armor was scale mail. Iron plates sewn in overlapping fish scale patterns onto leather, offering both protection and mobility. They were the fastest, most heavily armed, and most tactically sophisticated mounted warriors the ancient world had ever encountered, and the composite bow was the center of gravity around which their entire civilization and military system orbited. The Persian Empire, which at its height under Darius and Xerxes stretched from North Africa to Afghanistan and constituted the largest empire the world had yet seen, deployed composite bow archers at scale. Their elite unit, the 10,000 warriors known as the Immortals, were equipped with spears, swords, and composite bows. The Persian army's ranged firepower at Marathon, Thermopylae, and Plataea was composite bows. Their arrows, in the accounts of ancient historians, were numerous enough to darken the sky, a detail that may be literary exaggeration but reflects a genuine tactical reality. An army of composite bow archers could put arrows into the air at a rate of fire that simple bows could not match. Because the composite bow's mechanics allowed a faster draw and more efficient release than a long, heavy self-bow required to generate equivalent power, the Huns, who swept out of the Eurasian steppe in the 4th and 5th centuries CE and shattered the Western Roman Empire, built their entire military strategy around mounted composite bow archers. The Hunnic composite bow was a further evolution of the Scythian design, longer, with stiffened bone tips called siyahs that acted as levers, increasing draw length and arrow velocity beyond what earlier designs could achieve. A Hunnic army on the move was effectively a swarm of individual range weapons on horseback, each capable of devastating accuracy at distances that Roman infantry tactics were not designed to address. The Romans had legions of the most disciplined, well-organized, and effectively equipped infantry soldiers in Western history. Those legions broke against horse archer tactics repeatedly because the tactical problem they presented, kill what you cannot reach from distances that preclude response, had no good answer within the Roman military framework. And then came the Mongols. In the 13th century, Genghis Khan and his successors built the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from the Pacific coast of China to the doorstep of Central Europe, from the Russian steppe to the Persian Gulf. The Mongol military was not the largest army in the world. It was, in most of the campaigns that built the empire, significantly outnumbered. What it had, in addition to extraordinary organizational discipline, tactical sophistication, and strategic coordination, was the most refined version of the composite bow that the ancient world had ever produced. The Mongol composite bow used a bamboo core, layered with horn and sinew in the same basic pattern that had been developed centuries earlier on the steppe, but refined by generations of bowyers and warriors who had been training with the weapon since childhood. Mongol boys began training with bows as soon as they could walk. By the time a Mongol warrior rode to war, he had been shooting a composite bow for his entire conscious life, and he carried up to 60 arrows into battle. Mounted Mongol archers could release accurate shots at full gallop in any direction, maintain rates of fire that staggered observers, and sustain combat at distances that negated the defensive value of most fortifications, short of stone walls properly garrisoned. The Mongol composite bow could penetrate chainmail and lamellar armor at combat ranges. When the Mongols encountered a fortress too strong to storm directly, they used the same weapon system differently. They besieged it, cut off its supply lines with their superior mobility, and waited. The composite bow was both their primary offensive weapon and their strategic instrument of dominance over territory too large for any infantry force to control. The civilizations that fell to the Mongol expansion, the Jin dynasty of northern China, the Khwarezmian Empire of Persia and Central Asia, the Abbasid Caliphate centered in Baghdad, the Cumans and Kievan Rus of Eastern Europe, were not primitive or disorganized. They had armies, they had fortifications, they had their own military traditions and weapons. What they did not have was an answer to a force of mounted archers using a weapon that outranged, outmaneuvered, and outfired everything they could bring to bear. The composite bow did not win the Mongol conquests alone, but it was the technological foundation on which the entire Mongol military system rested. The composite bow remained the dominant long-range weapon in the Eastern world until firearms became reliable and affordable enough to replace it. A process that took until the 17th century in many parts of Eurasia, and later still in others. Ottoman composite bows, regarded by experts as the most refined expression of the form, were still in military use into the 19th century. The basic accoutrements of the weapon, the fish glue, the sinew, the horn, the wood, the thumb ring worn to protect the archer's draw finger from the string's violent release, remained essentially unchanged from the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE to the era of the musket. The fundamental engineering insight that produced the composite bow, that you could build a weapon more powerful than any single material allowed by combining materials with complementary properties, was never improved upon in 3,000 years of development. It was only superseded when a completely different energy source, chemical combustion, made the bow's mechanics irrelevant. But here's what matters more than the technical details, more than the draw weights, the ranges, the penetration values, the manufacturing timelines. What matters is what the composite bow actually did to the ancient world. It gave nomadic people who lived on the steppe, people with no permanent cities, no walls, no monumental architecture, no written records, no bureaucracies, no standing armies in the classical sense, the ability to defeat the largest, most organized, most resource-rich settled civilizations in human history. Repeatedly, over thousands of years, empire after empire built walls, trained soldiers, developed tactics, and found that none of it was sufficient when the riders came over the horizon with their small bowed weapons and their clouds of bronze-tipped arrows and their absolute refusal to fight in any way that the defenders had prepared for. The composite bow gave mobility the power of a siege weapon. It gave a single rider the firepower of multiple men. It gave steppe nomads the ability to project force at ranges that made their military inferiority in every other dimension irrelevant. And the civilizations that built the weapon, that refined it, that trained their children to use it from before they could ride, that made it the center of their entire way of life, used it to reshape the political geography of the ancient world again and again and again across 3 millennia. It started with a piece of wood, a strip of horn, a length of dried sinew, and a year of patient assembly in the hands of craftsmen who understood, without any formal theory of materials, science, or physics, exactly what they were doing. The arrow was already in the air before anyone saw the archer. That was always the point.